glad you're here, and I'm glad I'm here for what we're about to hear. James Hankins is somebody who I don't remember exactly where I first came across his name, but I did a little searching around on the internet, and I was truly impressed by the reputation and achievements of this man, who is not only a giant in his field, which is, or his most basic field, which is the intellectual history of the Italian Renaissance, but throughout the profession of historian, he's really one of the, I think, one of the leading lights in America, and it's really, I think, our privilege and pleasure to have him here. He's a professor at Harvard, has won just about every award, I think, that you can win in his field and recognition. I had read all this about him, and I thought, this sounds like somebody I really should do. If we can get him to come and speak for CLAFI, that would be great. And then a friend of mine who I think is a very sharp guy and a good lecturer himself, and somebody with a lively sense of the world, begged me to invite Jim Hankins. He thinks he's so great. So I put all that together, and it was really very easy to do. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you James Hankins.
Great, thanks for that very nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been to UCLA quite a few times, actually, because I edited a publication series, which is kind of a Loeb library for the Renaissance, called I Tatti Renaissance Library. I had a kind of West Coast branch of the editorial board out here. A couple of very close dear friends were on it, so I was out here quite a lot. And it's a pleasure to come back. I've spent the last 3 years writing a history of the Western tradition with my oldest friend, a guy named Allen Guelzo, who I've known since junior high school. And in fact, I first met him on the spelling bee. In 6th grade, he was in 8th grade, where we had a sharp disagreement about the spelling of anti-disestablishmentarianism, and I lost. And we never at that point dreamed that we were going to grow up both to be anti-disestablishmentarians, but now we're writing a book together. It's called The Golden Thread, The History of the Western Tradition. And I brought some copies of, that's just a sample of the first chapter, which they're printing up to whet people's appetites. It's being published by Encounter Books. And I think the books will be available in January. But if you want to look at that, feel free, and if they disappear, I won't mind. I won't have to carry them back in my baggage. So do as you will with them. Don't all rush at once to get them. But I think you'll see this is a very beautiful book, and I had a tremendously good time writing it. In addition to, Alan, my volume alone, which goes from 750 BC, from Homer basically, to 1500, to the end of the Renaissance. That is going to be 1,000 pages, but a lot of its illustrations, there are 480 illustrations and 88 maps just in my volume, and then Allen Guelzo, his volume is going to be 1,500 to the present. And it's going to be somewhat smaller than mine, but they're both hefty volumes, so something between textbook and a coffee table book. So tonight I want to try to explain why I wrote this book, why Alan and I wrote this book. In today's academy, even asserting the existence of a Western tradition seems to many people anachronistic, even reactionary, possibly. We're having trouble with the volume there? Okay. So I'd like to explain why I undertook the project, why I think it's important, and what I believe we can and should learn from the Western tradition. So in my view, this is a rather strong view, that restoring the study of the Western tradition, far from being a reactionary project, would in the present moment constitute a salutary way forward out of our current state of cultural collapse or malaise, and would constitute necessary rebalancing of history and education after the anti-Western excesses of recent years. All right. So I want to stipulate in advance that I'm speaking about the Western tradition, not about an entity called Western civilization singular. So the golden thread focuses on the tradition that binds together four civilizations: those of ancient Greece, beginning the 8th century BC, the Greco-Roman hybrid civilization that succeeded it, beginning roughly in the 2nd century BC, the Christian Roman Empire that began in the 4th century, was based in Constantinople, and finally European civilization whose origin can be traced back to the 11th century AD. So each of these civilizations inherited traditions from its predecessor via common languages or translations, including literary and artistic traditions, scientific traditions, political traditions, and religious traditions. Each successive civilization emphasized some elements of its predecessor while reshaping or suppressing other elements. So my volume takes the story up to 1500, just before the Reformation, when my co-author Allen Guelzo takes over and discusses the modernization and partial rejection of the inherited Western traditions, down to the end of the Cold War. We agreed on that division basically because I'm Catholic and Allen is Protestant, and we did not want to repeat the theological debates of our teenage years. So I just said, "You're doing the Reformation, whatever you say," and he has to agree to whatever I say about the medieval period. So actually we read each other's work and gave somewhat sharp remarks occasionally, but we've been talking about these subjects for 50 years, more than that. I'm almost 70, so we think we started talking about this almost 55 years ago. Okay. So we put our names on the title Allen Guelzo and James Hankins in alphabetical order because, in a way, even though I'm writing the early part, he's writing the later part, it's a kind of common point of view. So the two volumes cover approximately the same time span in geography as the traditional Western Civ textbook. The traditional Western Civ textbook was essentially a product of the Cold War. It's a genre that flourished from the 1950s, 1980s. There are 25 or 30 Western Civ textbooks that were written in America in that period. And though our work has approximately the same historical scope, it's quite different in its character assumptions and purpose. And of course it will be brought out into an America which is very different from the America of the Cold War. So if we go back and look at those textbooks that we used in America in the 1950s and 1980s, when Western Civ was usually required, or at least suggested by social studies regulations in the states, right, and also many colleges had Western Civ requirements in that period. So if we go back to those textbooks, we see we're in a very different world, a world of supreme American self-confidence. America, at this point, after the Second World War, saw itself as the vanguard of a Western civilization that represented the apex of human development. Before 1980, the driving question in Western Civ textbooks was, why the West? Why did the West get science, rationalism, freedom, wealth, capitalism, liberal democracy, rule of law, and overwhelming military power first, before the other world civilizations got them? Why would we be the first in the West? So the job of the Western Civ textbook was to explain this. It was thus constructed a teleological account of Western history, explaining everything in terms of this outcome. So we had to go back to the Greeks for democracy and rationalism. We went back to the Romans for republicanism and the rule of law. We went to the medievals for the university and first attempts to harmonize in faith and reason, to the Renaissance for humanism, to the early modern period for religious freedom and science, to the Enlightenment for liberalism and toleration, and to the late 18th century, 19th century for democracy and for what's now called the Great Divergence, right? The opening up of the vast gulf in wealth and power between the Western countries and non-Western countries, which was still very wide in the Cold War period. Now it's being closed, obviously. India and China are catching up in terms of their wealth and power. So let me mention a few key texts that illustrate this way of thinking. I call this the triumphalist way of thinking about the West and the rest. The first, in many ways, the most sophisticated, is William H. McNeill's Rise of the West, History of the Human Community, composed between 1954 and 1963, updated several times, continuously in print. It's actually a very valuable book to read. I'm not trying to diss it. I'm just trying to explain its outlook. A second book I would mention is Francis Fukuyama's End of History and the Last Man. It's a book published in 1992 and was as a kind of founding text of neoliberalism. By the way, he reworked this argument in much greater detail, much greater length, and much greater learning and sophistication in a two-volume work on political history, political order from prehistory to the present. This is a massive two-volume history that was published in 2011, 2014, where some of the triumphalism of the Cold War has kind of been worn down. The third book I'd mention was my colleague David S. Landa's book, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, published in 1998. Probably the last major book with the Cold War perspective on Western Civ. So the assumption of all these books is that the West represents a higher or a more modern stage in the history of mankind, and that it was therefore the duty of Westerners to try to bring the blessings of modernity to the rest of the world. So if we understood how Western Civ had entered modernity first, the rest of the world could try to recapitulate the Western pattern of development. So other world cultures like the Islamic world culture or Chinese cultural zones would need to experience something like our Reformation, our scientific revolution, our Enlightenment, our Industrial Revolution, if they wanted to modernize. If they did so, they would inevitably be brought along to embrace liberalism and democracy as well. It was assumed that you would not have a modern country unless it was a liberal democracy, and that these were preconditions of progress. So it's this perspective that led the U.S. government to support economic liberalization development in China, which we pay for it all in many cases, after 1978, after the death of Mao and when Deng came to power. They had the so-called Washington Consensus, and the view there was that if China became wealthy, it would become more like us, it would become a liberal democracy. And that conclusion survived until about 2015, when Xi Jinping's policies became a little more clear to us. So the Washington Consensus comes out of this idea that other parts of the world would have to imitate the Western pattern of development. And after 9/11, after the World Trade Center was knocked down in 2003, you kept hearing people say, it was a common belief, that the Islamic world needed a reformation. They had to have a reformation in order to liberalize the way Westerners would like them to liberalize. So this is a very wrong-headed idea for all sorts of reasons, but that was a common view, that we wanted, the Islamic world was primitive, it was feudal, it was medieval, and had to be modernized, and the way to do that was to bring a reformation along. So all three of the authors I just mentioned, McNeill, Fukuyama, and Landes, assumed that what had happened in other parts of the world that had begun to resemble the West during the 19th and 20th centuries, these are countries that were colonized by the West or eager to imitate the West, This was not westernization, but it was modernization. That's the key teaching of McNeill in particular, that we should forget about thinking of Western colonies as colonialism or westernization. We think of it as modernization. So it's not the West forcing its culture on other cultures via imperialism. It was the West modernizing other cultures, or other cultures eagerly embracing the obvious advantages of modernity, wealth, health, and military power. Modernity was thought to be inarguably a good thing. It was in principle possible and probably inevitable that all parts of the world would be modernized eventually. So the West is just the bellwether of the flock, and everyone's going to be modern someday. They're going to be liberal democracies, and they'll be rich and powerful like us. This is the way people were thinking in this period. So the assumption dovetailed nicely with development economics, a field of study popular during the 1960s and 70s in economics departments, including UCLA, government think tanks, NGOs, the World Bank. It was assumed that if non-Western countries wanted to get to modernity, they have to pass through the same series of economic transformations that the West had experienced. So they would require the weakening of religious authorities, the embrace of scientific rationalism, free market economics, individualism, democracy, human rights, and all countries would have to do this if they wanted to become wealthy. Again, an enormous assumption. And it's still, I think, a debate in the West whether, it's been quite clear that China managed to become very wealthy and very powerful without liberalizing in the Western way. There are still people out there who believe that, well, one day it'll break down, the mountain, that Xi Jinping will be thrown out and the Communist Party will lose its power and they'll be more like us. There's still people who hope that. And it may be true, I'm not a prophet, but that is still on the table, as it were, intellectually. So I call this narrative the West and the rest, the triumphalist narrative. And I want to emphasize right away that this is not the narrative that Allen and I have constructed in our history. In fact, we more or less repudiate triumphalism. In our book, which is looking like this. This is the cover. The book is going to be out in January, I think. I was just told in an email I got while I was sitting there that the book is going to be out in January. So our book has an entirely different purpose, entirely different goals. And as a first indication of these differences, I've just mentioned the chronological distribution of our narrative. If you look at these old classic Western civ books, Cold War period, they were maybe 1/3 pre-1800, 2/3 1800 of the present, because they're telling the story of modernity, and that's their focus. So the pre-modern world is not all that important. I used a book called Palmer Colton when I was in school, written by R.R. Palmer and Coulter was a Duke, who wrote very little of that book, and he got incredible royalties for decades. It was basically written by R.R. Palmer at Princeton, but that was that kind of book. It started in 1710. It's the second volume. So the second volume looks like this, and the first volume is this whole thing. So the classic Western civ book of the Cold War, it was devoted to modernity. Our book is the opposite. We have, I think, 2/3 of it is pre-1500, and 1/3 is 1500 in the present. So we have other goals, therefore different shape. And the reason for the distribution is that we're living in an entirely different cultural environment than the Cold War, one which faces the loss or forgetting of the West story entirely. We're living in an age of historical literacy where you can't mention, well, at least I can in my Harvard classes, mention major figures and have any assurance that they will be known. I once had a student, I was bellowing in my usual fashion, when I'm not mic'd, bellowing to my class about Western development, and so a student raised a hand and said, so which is first, the Enlightenment or the Reformation? Oh, okay. back up. Professors got to recognize what's not known. So there's a lot of cultural literacy out there which we're trying to solve. And we do a lot with, by the way, not just the bare bones historical narrative, we do a lot with the arts, music, architecture. I have a lot of architectural history in mind, and painting and sculpture and the like. So I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but that is in the book. From the perspective of our time, the 2020s, the Western triumph over the rest in the 20th century looks like it's going to be short-lived. When you're writing in 1945, and right after the Second World War, it looks like the West is the most powerful of all the civilizations of the world. And then this is before decolonization really got started in the 50s and 60s. So things look quite differently now. One aspect, of modernization is that we now fear more than ever, not only in America but elsewhere in the West, is the loss of the balance between the traditional and the modern. I think in some of these books, to their credit, there's an effort to say that we need both tradition and modernity. They have to balance each other, but we're losing that. Some forms of modernism have become openly hostile to tradition and advocate what Frank Furedi, an English writer on these subjects, calls year zero thinking, meaning an attempt to discard Western civilization. Western past and time, we've got to forget about it because it's corrupt, it's white supremacist, it's going to just give people bad ideas that they read about the West. Just discard it, start year zero, and start teaching the future, I guess is what they're going to teach. They want to teach history that conforms to current standards of moral purity. So this is our first objective regarding new history, is to respond to what I call the demonizing narrative. We have the triumphalist narrative, and we have the demonizing narrative of the West. So this narrative comes out of the post-colonial critique of the West. In recent years, it's replaced to an alarming extent the more balanced narratives of the past, American high schools and universities. This is also true of school curricula in Western Europe and Anglosphere generally. Though I have to point out that triumphalism was never a big a perspective that was popular outside the U.S., in the U.K. or in Europe, because Europe was going through decolonization. They weren't feeling triumphalist after the Second World War. In fact, history teaching in Western Europe and the UK since the 1920s has been overshadowed by a kind of declinism, a mood that became dominant in Europe. One symptom is this famous book of Oswald Spengler about the decline of the West in the 1920s. So Europe had a much darker mood about modernity. It took much longer to arrive in America, really not until the 1980s and 90s did triumphalism become intellectually and morally bankrupt for many people among American academics. So it's in those decades that teachers and professors started to lose any sense of balance about the achievements of Western civilization. Became all black and white and mostly black. So by the 2010s, two incompatible lines of attack on Western civilization had emerged. So one line of attack was put forward by my former colleague, Kwame Anthony Appiah, in a book called The Lies That Bind, who argued that the Western tradition is an ideological fiction. There's no such thing as the Western tradition. Actually, there was a title of a lecture he gave to the BBC that was the germ of the book. There is no such thing as the Western tradition. He says it's just contrived in the 20th century to justify Western imperialism and to fire up the troops to fight during the 2 world wars, to get them to think they're going to fight for something that's ancient. I wrote a long rebuttal of this in 2021, New Criterion 2021, so I'm not going to go into it. I think Anthony is a very clever man, very learned in his way, but this is somewhat willful misinterpretation as far as I'm concerned. So that's one line of attack on Western civ. The other line of attack admitted that Western civilization had existed, thank you very much, but denounced it as uniquely evil among the civilizations of the world. So the West is guilty. Slavery, racism, genocide. It's driven by a lust for global domination, a lust to feed the beast of uncontrolled, greedy capitalism, leading inevitably to environmental destruction, monstrous levels of income inequality, and the oppression of women in colonized peoples. So the evils of the West included ideological dominance, ideological oppression, namely the depiction of non-Western cultures in Western histories as primitive, irrational, despotic, superstitious, essentially inferior to post-Enlightenment Western nations. The most famous analysis of Western ideological imperialism you're probably familiar with is Edward Said's book called Orientalism, which he published in 1978. I also know him quite well. I like him very much, actually. He taught at Columbia when I was there as a graduate student. And one thing I appreciate about Said, I have to say, I want to say this because he's become a kind of whipping boy on the right. But Said always believed in keeping politics out of the classroom. You wouldn't think that, but he was not a guy who, he was taught literature, and he not a guy who wanted to turn literature into a political lesson. Okay, so the question that's now being asked about the West is not why was the West so successful, but now the question in the demonizing narrative is why is the West so evil? It's no coincidence that the slide from the triumphalism to demonization occurs sometime during the 1990s to 2010s. That's the approximate period when the demonization narrative gets going. And it's not surprising because it's exactly the same period when Western civ courses stopped being taught, both in high school and colleges, which meant that American students are very poorly equipped to resist the lies and excesses of the demonizing narrative at the very moment when it's become popular in K-12 education and in universities. So putting an end to the teaching of Western Civ, which happens really late 80s, early 90s, depending what part of the country, the center part of the country is much more conservative, happens later there. But it had unforeseen results. Described by David Brooks in his New York Times columnist 2017, he wrote, I'm going to quote him because I think it's a perceptive comment. It says, starting decades ago, many people, especially in universities, lost faith in the Western civilization narrative. They stopped teaching it, and the great cultural transmission belt broke. Now, many students, if they encounter it, are taught that Western civilization is a history of oppression. It is as if a prevailing wind which powered all the ships at sea had suddenly ceased to blow. Okay. So what replaced Western Civ is World Civ, basically, global history, world cultures. My high school, in fact, was ahead of the curve and started teaching world cultures soon after I graduated from it. So, teachers, history teachers have to teach something other than American history, so what they started teaching was global history, or world cultures. And there is a debate about this too, and there are a lot of defenders of global history and say that it's doing everything that the old Western Civ did. It's an adequate substitute for teaching Western history preferentially, even maybe a better substitute. They say the essential facts about the West are still being taught, just in a different, more equitable comparative context. And this is something I don't agree with, and I won't go into the reasons for it because they're complicated. I'll say a few things about it, but I have grave doubts about the efficacy of global history as a teaching tool, as a tool for socialization of youth. So global and comparative history can be done well. I'm not denying that. In fact, I've taught comparative history, intellectual history in Harvard for 2 decades. I teach a course called Care of the Soul, which compares Confucian, Western, Buddhist, and Islamic traditions of moral self-elevation. I taught a course with my colleague Peter Bohl, who's a Chinese historian, on political meritocracy, which is what I'm giving the seminar about on Saturday, actually, political meritocracy. We taught comparative courses in that, so I had no objection to teaching comparative courses. But global history courses, which are now, by the way, mandated in most states of the Union, right? Most states have departments of education, and they have curricula which they either require or suggest. The global history course, for me, is not an adequate substitute for courses on Western tradition for a variety of reasons. Structurally, they tend to sacrifice the diachronic to the synchronic, right? A story, a narrative that passes through time from earlier to later, to a synchronic descriptions that do a comparative approach by age. So they cut to pieces the narrative threads that tie together the story of particular civilizations over time. So this is another goal of our history, the Western golden thread. It's a big sacrifice to leave out narrative. Narrative is much more fun, first of all, especially for young students. They want to read narratives. They want to read biographies. They don't want to read analytical, sociological history. When they're young. Maybe in college they get more interested in that, but it's not what most people are drawn to history. Historical study want to study. So there's also serious pedagogical reasons why you would want diachronic history, narratives. It's the best way to understand the motivation and context of decisions made by historical actors. So if you want to understand how decisions are made, why decisions are made, and also exercise a moral judgment and prudential judgment about the quality of those decisions, you have to tell the narrative, right? Narrative history is the most valuable way of studying history when it comes to forming practical wisdom, teaching civic education, for example. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Stories are also more fun, they're more exciting for young readers. Narrative history enables us to recover the sense of adventure and the willingness to take risks that has been a defining feature of the West since the Achaeans set out to conquer Troy. And it's still with us, I think, in the new pioneers of space exploration. Apart from that, and more seriously, the lack of a narrative sense of the past based on original sources leads to a loss of the dynamic dimension of human history. History without a narrative thread, apart from being tedious, tends to essentialize cultures, simplify or conceal its protagonists' motivations. Students inevitably come away from the study of global history with static caricatures of other cultures. You can avoid that if you want, but it's much harder to do when you're doing global history, and you're doing usually the history of the globe in 1 year in an undergraduate high school course. I have nephews. 3 of my 4 nephews teach in public schools in Pennsylvania, so I have some ground level understanding of what is done in public high schools, and it's very hard to give any sense of the character of the civilization if you're going so rapidly through the historical and you're setting aside narrative and going through all these descriptive things. So you're essentializing. It's tendency to essentialize peoples and cultures. It's a crude and ahistorical project. It leads both to extremes of idealization. I would consider American exceptionalism an extreme of idealization, but also extremes of demonization. So settler colonialism is, to me, it's not really history, it's an ideological construct, mostly by sociologists and anthropologists who are not doing history. But it's an extremist position. And that's what happens when you leave out the narrative from the point of view of the actors. When you listen to them telling their own story, you're going to have a much more humane understanding of human history. So, so the synchronic approach that's typical of global histories also fails the test of moral seriousness. In my humble opinion, a proper moral judgment about the past requires narrative. We wouldn't pass judgment on someone in a courtroom without hearing their story. hearing their side of things, being cross-examined perhaps by a skeptic, who is the historian in this context. So the historian has to let all sides be heard as well, without a balanced account of the actions of the historical agent, and a attention to the historical agent's own goals, perspectives, and moral values, or lack of them. Students are not going to be able to assign praise and blame properly. That was always thought to be a major function of history, to assign praise and blame, so that the young and readers of history would understand what the tradition thought of certain individuals. And I think this, if you don't tell the narrative and read the sources, read the original actors' own perspective or that of the historians who lived at the time, you won't develop what I think is an important goal for history, which is to develop gratitude. Gratitude for what we've received in the past, a balanced appreciation for those who made possible the very real achievements of the West, which are not to be forgotten, and not just the bad things about the West. So I think to study history in its own terms is what gives us a proper sense of gratitude, humility, and admiration for great achievements. And young people need to have admiration. I really hate to see young people filled with hate and who are taught to hate things and to despise things. We should, people cannot live on that diet. So absent a narrative understanding of our shared past, students also lose all sense of belonging to a civilization, all sense of proportion about present events. Ignorance of our shared past is one reason, I believe, for the kind of cognitive problems that Jonathan Haidt's been talking about. I assume some of you know who Jonathan Haidt is, a very powerful writer about the effects of modern culture on the psyche of people who are subjected to it. So Jonathan Haidt talks about the younger generation, their inability to resist black and white thinking, the tendency to unconscious confirmation bias, catastrophism, and these habits of thought, which come, I think, from a lack of a very shallow historical perspective, lack of understanding of where we have been in the past. This is what leads to fanaticism. Ignorance of our own history, both Western and America, has left recent generations unable to participate fully in civil society. They're just hating each other, and they're taught to hate each other. So when it comes to civic education, ignorance of history is the functional equivalent of stupidity and leads to indifference. So we can talk about that later on, but I feel very strongly that this, history is absolutely necessary for people to have any kind of sanity about the events of their time. And we'll come back to that if you want to. So this is our first objective in writing the Golden Thread. We give a balanced, source-based response to malicious caricatures of the West being hawked by proponents of the demonization narrative. We correct the record, we balance the bad with the good, we provide some historical and comparative perspective. The way to control error, fake history, conspiratorial thinking, and hoaxes is with facts, which for historians means textual evidence. There's a lot of textual evidence in our book, and there's going to be an online supplement to that, but you'll see if you look at that book that it's filled with quotations and citations of historians. So one of the things we're trying to teach in this history is how historians think, how historians exercise their trade, and how they learn how to be critical. So we study all of the major historians from Herodotus onwards. They're at least mentioned and sometimes dealt with in depth, or at least in depth in a Western Civ book is a paragraph long, right? So, but we do try to talk about the historical perspective of different historians. We want students to understand that reliable history is based on a critical, disciplined review of evidence, and that means understanding what the perspective is and prejudices of the historians that you're relying on. I think for Herodotus, he gets 3 paragraphs. But that's That's a lot compared to most of what you're getting in a Western civ book. So we're also providing from time to time comparative material from other civilizations that will help students come to a balanced perspective on the West. And we're particularly attentive to this issue of slavery, because the West is often characterized as slave society and white supremacist society and all these adjectives by people who don't really know very much about it. So in the issue of slavery, for example, we point out the ubiquity of slavery in the pre-industrial world, in nomadic and prehistoric societies, as well as in city-based settled societies. It's pretty much everywhere. There's some form, different kinds of slavery, obviously, but there is unfree labor and oppression of the weak by the strong, and the Chinese, for example, have very little agricultural slavery, but they do have forced labor. So when the emperor comes to town, or his generals come to town, they say, build a canal, you have to put down all your tools you're a free peasant, yes, but you have to put down your tools and work for the emperor, work for the general. Forced labor, right? So that's not slavery, but it's something. The Chinese did have slavery, but I'm not going to try to diss the Chinese, because I have tremendous admiration for Imperial China, which I think in some ways has a superior government to what is happening at the same time in the West. So we talk about the Roman slave economy, which is certainly heavily dependent on free labor. It's an oppressive system, especially in agricultural slavery and slavery in the mines. But we also discuss the sermons of the Greek church father Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century figure, who is among the first, if not the first, I think he is the first, moral authority anywhere in the world calling for the end of the institution of slavery, and the first such authority to argue on Christian theological grounds for individual human dignity. Okay, there's some very rich literature on this now. So we point out the little known fact that Western Europe itself, during the early Middle Ages, was a principal source of slaves for the Islamic world. The Islamic world in the early Middle Ages, certainly the 8th and 9th centuries, is the most powerful and civilizationally advanced part of the world, and they had a ruling that Muslims can't enslave other Muslims. That's a principle of Muslim law. So they have to get their slaves somewhere else. They get them from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but they get them from Europe too. So my colleague Mike McCormick has written an enormous book called The Arts of the European Economy, which lays all this stuff out in tremendous detail. And most people aren't aware that Europe itself was basically the Africa of the early Middle Ages. It was providing slaves to more richer, more powerful parts of the world. So the comparative perspective is important when assessing the moral failures of the West. Historically shallow critics of the West and Christianity often ask why, once Christians took over the Roman Empire in the 4th century, why they didn't immediately abolish slavery. Of course, they're Christians, they shouldn't believe in slavery. Slavery's bad. Christians want to be, egalitarian. All people are equal in the sight of God. So why didn't they just abolish slavery? So our account describes the place of slavery in the Roman economy and society in order to make clear why sudden structural changes would have been destabilizing. And then we introduce historical comparison, because as it happens, there's another instance in world history of rulers who tried to do this, the Chinese. There's a Chinese emperor named Wang Mang, who lived in the 1st century AD, who tried to abolish slavery and to redistribute the land during the Han. So his decree, which was inspired by Confucian ideals of social harmony, very noble ideals of the Confucian tradition, led to political chaos, just as Theodosius I feared would happen if he did anything to immediately change the slave system. So after 3 years in China, slavery was reinstituted, Wang Mang was assassinated, and then a rapid end was brought to the dynasty that he had founded. So it was, there was kind of a historical parallel which shows that rapid historical change, the attempt to get rid of slavery, did actually destabilize the society in China. So in addition to giving students the wherewithal to question unbalanced characterizations of the West, we've also tried to provide a storyline, counter and correct the triumphalist narrative of Western modernity. I'm not going to go into this because I don't, I'm going to skip over this part to get to the part about Phronesis. So the point I'm skipping is, if you want to talk about it later, we can talk about it. But I'm skipping the part where we replace a narrative of history that's basically Hegelian. It tries to prove there's a right side of history and a wrong side of history, and there's historical laws that you can predict what's going to happen and what the right side of history is. We don't do that. We have a more contingent, non-teleological narrative. I'm going to skip all that. So I'll just make the point that when you tell history from a contingent narrative, it's much more exciting because it's not obvious how it's going to turn out. And the story of Rome actually is quite an exciting story because it has all these near-death experiences. The Romans and miraculous survivors. Rome starts, according to legend, 753 BC, but it nearly came to an end, rapid end, many times in the early centuries. In 390, Rome was conquered by the Gauls, and only a few heroic leaders were able to save it from being completely destroyed. Hannibal, Mithridates, the collapse of the Roman Republic, the 3rd century crisis in the AD period, the 5th century collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the fall of Rome as it's usually called, the Islamic invasions of the 7th century, the revival of Byzantine power in the 10th century, the Battle of Manzikert when Byzantines lose the wealthiest part of their empire. There are these ups and downs all through the history of Rome. And it's a quite exciting story. And one of the lessons I'm trying to teach is that readers will know that there's always hope for civilization. The decline is not inevitable. That there are many declines in history from which we have recovered and other civilizations have recovered. So even when it seems hopelessly corrupt, your times seem hopelessly corrupt or overmatched by rival rising powers, there's still the possibility of escape. From that, virtue matters, especially strength, loyalty, and perseverance. It matters who wins the battles. Right? There's so many battles, key battles in Western ancient history, where very important, where the survival really of ideals were at stake. The battle of well, I have to skip all this because otherwise we'll be here all night, and I know you don't want to be here all night. So, but it's important to remember that history is contingent. It does matter. It does matter that when people behave bravely and fight hard, and for their civilization, that they're willing to undergo self-sacrifice. And the Romans are really kind of amazing people in the end. The Romans won the great majority of their battles because they believed in themselves. They always expected to win. They believed that God's favored them. And they never gave up. That's the thing about the Romans. They never give up. Their empire is great and long-lasting, in part owing to their great traditions, the nobility of public service, self-sacrifice for the republic and for the state. Lessons that we could remember today. Okay. So I'm going to get into a third aim of our history, which is reviving prudential history. What we want to do in this history is to revive a way of doing history that's not been really done since the Hegelian period, since the modern period. Before modern history came along, this is Polybius, most historians were writing for the sake of informing prudence, informing practical wisdom. They thought that history repeated itself, or at least resembles different historical situations, resembled other historical situations, and that the statesman or the citizen who studied history would be prepared for all eventualities. They would find patterns, be able to recognize patterns in their history. So Alan and I are trying to revive this great tradition of pre-Hegelian historiography. It's Hegel who really puts an end to this tradition, because it really initiates the progressive attitude to history, that history can never learn from the past, because every earlier stage of history is different from the modern stage of history. If you have an idea of progress, that history, that things are moving towards the freedom of the spirit, as Hegel would say, that the past is really nothing to teach you, because it's the future that we're going to be better in. And the traditionalists like myself would say, well, there are no examples of virtue in the future yet. We want examples of virtue, we have to look to the past. So we're trying to go back to this, revive this idea of prudential history, learning from the past. It's somewhat parallel to what Neil Ferguson's trying to do at the University of Austin, Texas. He's trying to revive applied history. He's written a lot about this. It's a very sophisticated approach. We're thinking more in terms of informing citizens and statesmen about the range of possibilities that are existing. So we have certain beliefs about how we can learn from history prudentially. We reject the idea that history is predictive social science. That's the a modernist view. We don't think we can play the part of divine providence, and science is not going to help us to play the part of divine providence. We learn from the past by having great knowledge of the past, and many having vast knowledge. You know, Cicero says somewhere that the man who knows no history remains forever a child. So it's kind of vicarious age when you learn history. You extend your experience beyond that of your own lifetime. And this is something I'm going to write a book about after my next book will be about the practical wisdom, learning practical wisdom from history. There was an age when this was very popular, from the Renaissance through the 17th century. And one of the effects of this was that Europe became very curious about the history of other countries. So when the Jesuits went to China, one of the things they tried to do is to understand Chinese history, translate Chinese history, because they wanted to extend their prudence. They wanted to give themselves a kind of knowledge that wasn't available. So the Western, the Greeks actually start this. The Greeks, tremendously curious. Most of what we know about Mauryan civilization of India comes from Greek sources, and most of what we knew about Egypt until hieroglyphs were decoded in the early 19th century, that came from the Greeks, ditto Babylonians. And so it's a feature of Western civilization that is curious about other civilizations. But part of the driver there is the desire to enrich one's prudence, one's practical wisdom, by knowing more and more about history. Good. So, these are kind of classic examples that people used to study in the pre-progressive historical context. So I'm not going to go through this. What did Rome do right that enabled it to conquer the Mediterranean? That was a big subject for any lecture. Of course, on the Roman history, they would They were always asked that question: how did Rome conquer the Mediterranean? What led to the fall of the Roman Empire? What led to the fall of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BC? Why did the Roman Empire in the West fall in the 5th century BC? These are all kind of classic historical questions. But something we go into a bit in the book is trade-off analysis. And these are, we propose various kinds of trade-offs and try to provide the historical examples. So one of the big questions in history is whether professional armies are better or citizen armies are better, and there's arguments on both sides. Or the advantage of having strong men, dictatorships, or obsonetes is the Greek word. We say czars today, right? We white people czars. I remember, who was the guy who was the education czar under Reagan?
William Bennett?
Bennett, yeah, Bennett was the education czar. But occasionally, we had this popular idea of having a czar, but it's basically the Roman idea. And the advantage and disadvantage of popular deliberation, plebiscites, for example. The pre-modern republics, before the American Republic, it was mostly, and this is the Roman model, the Roman model before the American Republic was that deliberation should be done by the wise and voting should be done by the many. So the wise would come up with the policies, they would formulate the laws, then they would send them to in the Senate, right, and they would send them to the assemblies, and the people could vote yes or no. And so the people were simply to authorize what the wise had thought up. Of course, it never really worked that way, because eventually, when the people said no, the Senate would then say, well, why'd you say no? And how can we revise this legislation so we'll get to yes? So there is always deliberation in these situations, but the American founders are really quite remarkable in proposing that the people, the citizens, all the citizens should deliberate in public, and not just behind closed doors. All right. So I was going to give you, I'm afraid I'm running out of time. How's the time situation going here?
Fine.
You're doing fine? Okay, I don't want to go on forever. But I thought this would make an interesting example of trade-off analysis. The question of, do you want to have a strong man? And most people today say, you don't have a dictator. Their first association with Mussolini and Hitler, called themselves dictators, right? These are horrible people. They see dictators are the opposite of democracy. You can't have a republic and a dictator, right? In fact, the dictator is a Roman magistrate, emergency magistrate, and it's an official, they have official restrictions. They have to have a causa, which is they have to be made dictator over something, and they're given, the Senate will give them a thing to do. The Romans basically had a problem with political gridlock. That was, the Roman state was something like the American state, in that they had a lot of, they didn't have a written constitution, so what was the proper procedure in any case was a matter of memory and precedent, living memory to a surprising extent. The Romans also were in love with legal gamesmanship. They're constantly, they love going to court. And you put that together with the general turbulence of the early republic and the struggle between the orders, that is between the plebeians and the patricians, and you have a lot of gridlock. So the dictators were chosen for a 6-month period of time. They were given the causa to solve this problem. You know, you've got the plebs are refusing to serve in the army. So what do you give them what they need, and you solve this problem. And the patricians just have to shut up and do what you tell them to do. So the dictator will say, okay, well, the plebeians don't like not having any representation in the government, so give them a tribune, give them a consul. They made these, they cut through all the procedural blockages in the Roman system, and the acts of the dictator could not be appealed to the courts. So they got stuff done. And the Romans had 40 dictators before the 1st century BC. And then it started to go bad. And the dictators started becoming heads of armies, and you had Sulla, and you had Julius Caesar, and you had other dictators who were not good for the Roman state. But for a long time, for 5 or 6 centuries, the Romans had dictators. So I think this is, I'm not advocating dictatorship, mind you. I'm just saying that a prudent person will want to know what all the possibilities are, and they might be able to come up with a American version, for example, or perhaps a British version of a constitutional officer who has extraordinary powers to take care of particular problems. But you recover that from history. You don't recover that from our current prejudices. Okay, one more thing I'm going to talk about, which is something else we're trying to get or to illustrate from our history, which is the fragility, but also sometimes the surprising durability of the golden thread of Western tradition across centuries and between civilizations. And when the Romans take over Greek civilization, they have just defeated them in battle, and they have a great deal of contempt for certain Greeks. They tended to admire the Greeks that were dead in the 5th century Greek Athenians and the Spartans. But there's a lot of Roman prejudice against the Greeks. But at some point in the 2nd century, basically, a few senators said, you know, we really need we need the civilizational tools that the Greeks have invented. So we're going to bring them into Roman role. The Greeks have art of rhetoric, they have art of grammar, which fixes their language. They have many arts, architecture, and we're going to try to take them over, or at least the ones that we need to take over. So it takes a visionary people to say that we're not just going to crush another civilization and destroy it. There's many examples of that in history. I'll show you one. So the Khmer Empire, which is almost as large as the Roman Empire in Southeast Asia, well, it's about 2/3 of the Roman Empire, lasts a long time, and it was completely destroyed. We have nothing, we have almost no sources about this. The sources we have are not written by Cambodians. This is the Khmers, right? They're written by Chinese. That's how we know about the Khmer Empire through Chinese sources and a few other sources. But basically, they don't preserve themselves, and their legacy, whatever it is, was lost. But in the West, we have civilizations that these different civilizations that have been willing to remember the good things and forget the bad things about the civilizations that they've conquered. So when the Christians take over the Roman Empire in the 4th century, there are a lot of fanatical Christians out there saying, burn it to the ground, knock those pagan temples down, forget about pagan literature. It's all written, forget about Virgil. He's writing about gods, and he's writing about what Virgil, Dido and Aeneas get up to in Book 4 of the Aeneas in that cave. We can't have young Christians being perverted by adultery, right? So there are a lot of people who were quite extreme in the 4th century, but there were wiser heads that prevailed. And St. Augustine, St. Jerome, a few other saints. St. Basil says it was the Greek saints said, no, we got to save. We need some parts of Greek civilization, Roman civilization. They're very valuable, and we'll keep them. And they did. And we have them today because they made that decision. And then, of course, you have the Europeans who conquered Byzantium in 1204, a very shameful incident when they destroyed the greatest city in Christendom. But the Greeks, the Romans, the Latins also at a certain point said, no, the Greek civilization is too valuable to lose. We Latins think we're better, but nevertheless, the Greeks have really got a lot of stuff that we don't have. So in the late 15th century, well, throughout the 15th century really, but especially in the late 15th century after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, there's a concerted movement among the Latins to recover Greek civilization. They had, Lorenzo de' Medici sends the ships of merchant ships all around the Greek world to collect Greek manuscripts. They are translating, they're learning Greek grammar, and lo and behold, after the end of the 15th century, the West is the second classical language. We have Greek. Because Greek had never been a classical language studied in the West before that time. There were Westerners who knew, they knew Greek medical texts, or they knew Aristotle, but the idea that you would make that part of the educational system, that the study of Greek would be studied alongside of Latin. Now, that's a late 15th century invention, is because a lot of people, including Pope Pius II is one of the great leaders in this, and Lorenzo de' Medici. It was a civilizational project in Renaissance Italy to say we have to save the Greek civilization, otherwise it'll all be lost. And there's a huge civilizational project to translate all of Greek literature, Greek science, Greek philosophy into Latin. And that goes on from the 15th, 16th century into the 17th century. So that's an important thing, that the continuity has been established with these past civilizations, even though in some cases they had a kind of hostility towards them. But the tradition is very fragile, and I want to make a couple of illustrations of just how fragile it is, because a lot of people don't really realize how near we came to losing major cultural achievements of the Romans. So the Romans in the 6th century, or Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, decided to make a compilation of all Roman law. It's called the Corpus Juris Civilis. It was done in the 1630s, and they had a textbook which they used called the Institutes, and they had made collections of laws. And then they had decided to collect the decisions of famous Roman jurists. So the 3rd century, the late 2nd, 3rd century is a golden age of Roman jurisprudence. So they made a collection of the stuff. And it's called the Digest. Sometimes called the Pandex. There are two names for it, Pandex and Digest. So the Digest was basically lost except for a single manuscript. It's just incredible. It's this manuscript here. It's the Codex Florentinus. It's in the Renaissance Library in Florence. And until the late 11th century, there was a period when this is the only manuscript. Okay, so in the 12th century, they decided to revive Roman law under the Holy Roman Emperors decided that they needed to fight back against papal law. And so they started copying the manuscripts again, and they developed, Roman jurisprudence as a Western in the Western tradition. So I'm not sure if they do that in the law school here. Do they still teach Roman law in UCLA?
Not much. There might be a course, but it's not a course of study.
Well, it has, up until quite recently, it was something that people studied regularly in American law schools. They read the Digest. And there's this long tradition, and the Digest informs all the jurisprudence of the West and the Middle Ages through the modern period. One manuscript, incredibly fragile. I'll show you another example. I can't read this, but Aristotelian corpus, right? So after Aristotle died, his manuscripts were given to Theophrastus, who handed them over to an heir of Aristotle's, and they ended up in the library of the Political Meritocracy. So most of the manuscripts that most of the treatises of Aristotle that we have were in this one box, sitting in somebody's basement. Okay, there are several sources for this story. It's not just one source. So the Aristotelian corpus, which is the backbone of education in Europe from the 12th century to the 17th century, okay, this was down to a single box of manuscripts in the 1st century BC, and Sulla brought it back from Athens when he was reducing the place to rubble. But we can sort of forgive him for having brought back the Aristotelian corpus, which then gets copied, and then people start commenting on it. So the tradition of commentary on Aristotle goes back to only back to the 1st century BC. Again, you know, a major, major, you know, part of the Western intellectual tradition, which is really very fragile. It's kind of scary when you think about it. There are many examples of this. I mean, here's Catullus. There's one manuscript of Catullus left in the 14th century. It was in the Archdiocesan Library of Verona, and somebody discovers it. There are many, many, many texts that were down to a single manuscript. Once printing is invented, of course, then things are safe. And the printer, Aldus Manutius, is the printer of the classics in the 1490s and early 1500s. He is very conscious that when he makes he's also printed many of the first editions of Greek texts. He's very conscious that when he publishes it, it's safe. You can't, it's, you know, 500 copies of Catullus is enough to make sure that it's going to be around forever. So that's the real change, but it's very fragile up to that point. And I want to give you one example of the durability of tradition, which I think is you know, the golden thread in action, basically. So after the fall of the Roman Republic, that's the end of, well, the Republican tradition basically dies out in the 1st century AD. The Roman Republic is usually considered to have fallen in 31 BC, with Augustus becoming the Battle of Actium. The Romans themselves considered the Republic to have died out, I think, I forgot the exact date, but sometime in the 1st century AD, when there's a document which purports to be the Roman people giving away their decision-making capacity to the emperor. Probably fake. So there is no republicanism in western part of the Mediterranean, the Latin-speaking part of the Mediterranean. There's no republicanism at all for 1,000 years. Okay? The Greeks have the memory of it. They have you know, some cities that still practice a form of democracy. Of course, they're not really democracies, but they go through some of the forms. The real powers with the emperor or the local governor. But in the West, the Latin West, there's no republics, okay? And a lot of these cities die out because of their barbarians, and they just can't keep themselves going. And a lot of the big cities are ruled by bishops. And sometimes the bishops will consult, you know, other people, but it's basically monarchical decision-making down until the 12th century. And then what happens in the 12th century is that the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire have a bust-up, right? There's the investiture controversy and the Gregorian reform, which strips financial power away from the Holy Roman Empire and divides the loyalties of Europeans. So the Holy Roman Empire becomes drastically weak with the rise of the papacy in the late 11th, 12th century. So then what happens? Well, the states of northern Italy, which have become very wealthy because of the agricultural revival, various reasons, they become very wealthy. They start to become independent, self-governing states. They call themselves communi, right, communes. And they, you know, how are they governed? Well, they have two consuls that are governing them, right? And who are the elders? The elder called anciani, which in Latin gets translated senatus. And then the assemblies are called comitia. So the Romans somehow, the Italians, North Italians, somehow remembered all of these Roman Republican institutions from 1,000 years previously. So how do they do that? Well, they're reading Sallust, they're reading Cicero, they're reading Livy, all these texts are being copied, and they remember. The tradition survived, even though the actuality of Republican government did not survive, the memory of it did. And that's a very remarkable thing. It's something we need to remember about the Romans, about the Western tradition. It does keep going, and it can be revived. And there are renaissances and there are revivals, and it's very important for us to remember right now. Obviously, you know, Frederick I Barbarossa, the first person to call himself a Holy Roman Emperor, he's trying to destroy these cities. And because he wants them back. He used to have their regalia rights, as they're called. He used to have their income, and he loses it when there's the bust up with the papacy. And for 20 years, he tries to conquer northern Italy. Every year he's down there with his armies for major invasions, and eventually he gets beaten. There's a great battle. This is the battle of Legnano in 1176, when Frederick just gets beaten, and he has to say, "Okay, republic is a legitimate form of government." He's the first person to ever say that since the beginnings of the Roman Empire with Augustus, right? So, and that's and everyone forgets this because we always pay attention to Magna Carta and the British tradition of consultative government and the sharing of power between the Parliament and the King. And that's obviously very important, but even before that, actually not too much earlier, the whole tradition of republics is founded from the past. So this is the golden thread in action. And this is what we're trying to accomplish with this book. And, all right. Illustrate the fragility, but also the durability of this. So I'll just conclude. My conclusion is that we need to revive the study of Western tradition if we want to reverse the cultural collapse of the West that has occurred in recent decades. We need those in control of our cultural institutions to put away the wrecking ball that has been thoughtlessly knocking down our institution, our cultural traditions, and the denigration of Western story needs to be balanced by a fair account of its achievements. Those who believe we can simply discard the Western past like an outworn suit are hopelessly naive as well as ignorant and destructive. Western countries can no more cease being Western than an individual can discard his own DNA and choose a new set of genes. Someone who destroyed his own DNA would cease to exist. Trees that are uprooted die. What we are and can only choose to cultivate our sound traditions, to prune away the mistakes of the past, and to repudiate our crimes. We cannot pretend that our history did not happen. To condemn the whole Western tradition as fundamentally flawed, as sometimes people are doing today, is a sign either of colossal ignorance or malicious fanaticism, or both. Some modern critics of the great traditions of the West are less radical. They just want to hack off a few branches here, kill parts of the root system there, replace them with artificial roots and branches. But these critics are, as a rule, poor political gardeners. This is my metaphor for what politics should be. It's not fixing a machine, but gardening. They have no deep understanding of how civilizations have been improved in the past. They're heedless of the ways that civilizations have fallen into ruin. Only the study of Western history can teach us the best ways to cultivate the garden of our civilization, protect it from internal diseases and parasites, and fence it off from external threats. Thank you. I'm sorry for having talked way too long, but I saw no one running for the room, or one person.
We'll have questions and answers. I just want to mention that Allen Guelzo actually has been here. I think he's been in the CLAFI lecture 3 times. Wonderful lecture.
He's probably much longer than I am.
Pardon?
He probably talks much longer than I do.
I don't think so. I don't know. But but you gave us the first half, so maybe we should have him come and give the second half. Questions?
Questions? Discussion? Yes.
Well, I was kind of curious, I mean, I thought that was very interesting, but I was kind of curious how your conclusions would apply to what's happening now. In other words, we're in a state of turmoil, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And you have a certain prescription for how civilizations can take the best and, without letting the whole thing go. So what would be your current day suggestions, I don't know, on the political front, on the any kind of front for how we should go forward?
Well, I try to avoid partisan politics, and papers like this, so I
You
just make
speak up, please.
As I try to avoid partisan political statements in lectures like this, but I think education, basically there are two types of reformers. There are people who reform institutions and people who reform educational systems or try to change education. So my only area of expertise would be education. There are things that could be done politically, but I'm not going to go into that because that's factionalized in the discussion. But we can, I think, agree, we should agree about what students need to know. And I think they need to know their own tradition, American tradition, and in a way that's not hostile to it, that is fair-minded, not saying everything has to be praised, but saying that, taking people's motives seriously. It's something I've always tried to do in historical writing, is to avoid modern ahistorical, meta-historical judgments, and making such judgments without paying attention to what the historical actors themselves are saying. There's a tendency to dismiss whatever historical actors say and think we know better. So I think education needs, I think that historical education has to be restored. The history profession, as you might know, is collapsing. Our enrollments in history courses is collapsing. And I think that's bad. I think we have to maybe require some history of people. We used to require American history, civics, Western history, and we can do that again.
Same with literature.
Same with literature, yeah, absolutely. Yes.
I sort of follow up to that question. I just read your Virtue Politics, which I found fascinating. But the question is, how do you get from I'll call it the relatively easy statement, we should do thus and such. In
Yeah.
that case, we should recognize that virtue is a real thing and that it's essential for leadership. But how does a society, and that was one that was probably at least as fragmented as this one. How did they develop consensus? And I don't mean necessarily in a formal, organized way, but something happened where they built momentum around a different way of thinking about what's valuable and what isn't valued, and how to pass it on to the next generation and so on.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well, they had a movement. I mean, the humanist movement, which is a Christian humanist movement. I always have to point that out because people think that humanism is the modern humanist, which is anti-religious. But the humanist movement was what it did. The people agreed that the inspiration for the humanist movement was the collapse of Italy in the 14th century. Everything was falling apart. And so someone like Petrarch, who's the real leader of this movement, the poet Petrarch, says he's reading Roman history. He's got his shelves full of Roman history, Roman literature, Roman poetry, and he's saying, where is all that virtue? He has somewhat obviously an idealized view of the Romans, but nevertheless the Romans had a 1,000-year-long civilization, or 2,000 if you want to count Christian Rome. They were powerful, and they had admirable people. They read a lot of Plutarch, these guys. They saw, and their conclusion was that the quality of humanity has fallen off. So how do we get it back? Well, we want to have great men and women like the ancients had. We have to have their educational system. And they blamed the barbarians for wiping out the ancient educational system, so they tried to restore that. They created the humanist school. So they had a movement. But there are also what seminars about actually on Saturday is the attempt to create meritocratic institutions by the greatest political theorist you've never heard of, a guy named Francesco Patrizio Siena, who was told by Pope Pius II, a humanist pope, that he should write a treatise on how to bring back the principle of merit in society. So get rid of the hereditary principle, or modify the hereditary principle, and make merit the driving force of government. So he has a whole set of proposals, political proposals, about how you can elevate the worthy in society, what kind of institutions you would use. He has a combination of sortition and election. He copies from Venice because he thinks the Venetians have got the best republic, but he comes up, one of his proposals is to make sure the wealthy are not too, he's very worried about the wealthy wrecking society, and he has a proposal to limit the power of the wealthy. He's not socialist, he's more of a distributivist, but he thinks that there should be limits on how much the wealthy can own. The state should own a lot of the land, which is, of course, all wealth is agricultural wealth in this period. The state should own 2/3 of the land, basically, and 1/3 should go to support the church, and 1/3 should support the poor and the military, and the third can be handed out as private property to the citizens. Right? So he wants a powerful, wealthy state, but he wants it in the service of creating a meritocratic state. So there are all sorts of proposals around.
So do we need a patriarch or dictator?
Well, there is the classical education movement going on around, and they're very interested in this sort of educational proposals, yeah.
I noticed that one of your bullet points that you didn't get to interested me because I teach at a university. It was the question, what happens when a university system is overly politicized? And you had, I think you said, for example, in 17th century England. So could you talk a little bit about what the answer to that question is?
Well, that's what happened. The British University in the 17th century, it was torn apart by fights between Puritans and Royalists. And the outcome of that was 200 years of stagnation in university. The intellectual life of Britain did not take place in the universities between basically 1650 and late 19th century. It happened elsewhere. Universities were dead. When Gibbon goes to Oxford, he says he's bored out of his mind. There's nobody doing anything. There's no intellectual life at all. That's what happens when you politicize universities.
That's cheerful to hear.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, it means you have to not politicize it.
Or wait 200 years.
Yeah. Or wait 200, yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think we can call it a night. Thank you, James Hankins.